Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Bean Family Stories channel. This is where we bring you interesting, funny and inspiring stories from Mr. Bean family every day. You will meet me, Mr. Bean's daughter, someone you may be familiar with and I hope you love, my dad with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely brother who always brings positive energy with his stories close to life. Every day, one of us will share new stories, interesting journeys, and today it's my turn. I will take you on an exciting adventure, but also with profound lessons about life. Today's story carries a simple but important message: never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprises waiting for us. If you like our family dynamic, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave some interesting comments to let me know what you think. Now, let's dive into today's story and dive into the world of surprises. Let's get started. Emily Parker walked down the busy streets of Manhattan, the evening lights casting a warm glow on her face as the soft breeze played with her blonde hair. At 34, Emily had found a quiet confidence that came with years of experience, both in her professional life as an art teacher and in her personal life as the wife of James Parker, a tech entrepreneur who had made a name for himself in the sustainable energy sector. Though she lived a life that many would consider luxurious, she remained grounded, comfortable in her simple ways. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, she had a plan to surprise James, a surprise that involved revisiting the Crystal Palace, the exclusive restaurant where they had celebrated their first date 14 years ago. Emily was dressed simply, as usual. A beige cardigan, comfortable jeans, and flats, her outfit reflected her practical nature rather than any desire to impress. She had just wrapped up her pottery class at the local studio, the clay still faintly visible beneath her fingernails. Though she hadn't planned to dress up, she felt a flutter of excitement thinking about the evening ahead. The reservation for next Friday was something she had been working on for weeks, knowing how nearly impossible it was to get a table at the Crystal Palace. She hadn't expected that tonight's visit would lead to more than just securing a reservation. The restaurant's grand facade came into view, its golden lights spilling onto the sidewalk, casting a luxurious glow. Emily paused for a moment to take it all in: the crystal chandeliers, the pristine white tablecloths, and the elegant patrons dining inside. This was where she and James had first shared a meal when he was still just a promising young engineer, full of dreams and determination. Back then, neither of them could have imagined the heights they would reach. Now, as a successful tech innovator, James's work with sustainable energy was changing industries, and Emily had supported him through it all. But tonight, the surprise was hers. She checked her watch, perfect timing. Emily felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing she was one step closer to making the evening just right. She pushed open the heavy glass door, the crisp sound of it cutting through the quiet hum of the city. Inside, the refined atmosphere of the restaurant enveloped her, but she couldn't help but feel a slight sense of discomfort. The gleaming interior, the suits, the dresses, it was all a world away from the clay-streaked hands and comfortable clothes she had become accustomed to in her art studio. The maitre d', Victoria, stood by the podium, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit. Her gaze swept over Emily with barely concealed judgment, taking in her casual appearance. Emily smiled warmly and approached. "Good evening. I'd like to make a reservation for next Friday if possible," she said politely, trying to ignore the subtle but noticeable scrutiny. Victoria's face remained neutral, but her tone was anything but welcoming. "I'm afraid we're fully booked for the next 3 months, madam," she replied, her words clipped. Unfazed, Emily maintained her smile. "I understand how busy you must be. It's for a special anniversary, and this place means a lot to my husband and me. We had our first date here." Before Victoria could respond, a man in a sharp, expensive suit approached the desk. Emily recognized him instantly: Richard Hammond, a local real estate developer notorious for his flashy lifestyle and frequent appearances in the city's social pages. He made no attempt to acknowledge Emily as he marched up to the desk. Victoria, he said, his voice laced with annoyance, my usual table isn't ready, and I specifically requested the 82 Bordeaux. It should be ready immediately. Victoria's demeanor shifted from cold to attentive in an instant. Right away, Mr. Hammond, she responded, her voice smooth with deference. Emily, standing to the side, felt an uncomfortable wave of heat rise in her chest. She had never been a fan of this kind of display, wealth flaunted without a second thought. Richard Hammond's eyes flicked over to Emily, his gaze lingering for just a moment before turning away dismissively. I thought this place had standards, he muttered under his breath, clearly meant for Emily to overhear. Since when do we let just anyone walkin' off the street? Emily felt her heart skip a beat, but she stood tall. She was no stranger to being judged for her appearance, but this felt different. I understand the restaurant's prestige, sir, she said, her voice steady despite the sting of his words. I'm only trying to make a reservation for next week, not dine tonight. Hammond's smirk deepened as he spoke over her, his tone dripping with disdain. Listen, this isn't some casual diner. People wait months for reservations here. They dress appropriately. He gestured toward her jeans with an air of disgust. Emily's cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. I understand, she said evenly, trying to maintain her composure. I was simply asking if I could speak with the manager about any possible availability. Victoria didn't respond right away but instead stepped back to attend to Hammond's concerns, her attention fully diverted. Emily's patience, which had been steady up until now, began to wear thin, but she remained silent, unwilling to let a few hurtful comments derail her evening. She had a reservation to secure, after all, it was an important occasion. As Victoria rushed off to deal with Hammond's complaints, Emily stood there, trying to collect herself. The sting of the situation was beginning to set in. She had come here to make a reservation for a special night, and yet she was being treated as if she were some sort of nuisance. The realization hit her harder than expected. The Crystal Palace, a place that held so many memories for her and James, had somehow turned into a symbol of everything she disliked about high society. Hannah, a soft laugh escaped her lips, though it lacked any real humor. She wasn't upset with the criticism itself, it wasn't the first time she'd been judged based on her appearance. What bothered her most was how quickly people assumed her worth based on a few simple visual cues. She could almost hear Richard's voice echoing in her mind, belittling her presence as though she didn't belong. A few moments passed before Victoria returned, her tone more clipped than before. I'm afraid I wasn't clear earlier, madam, she said, her voice cool and professional. We're simply not able to accommodate any more reservations. The restaurant is fully booked. Emily didn't flinch, though she could feel her fingers tighten around the straps of her purse. I understand, she said calmly, though the weight of her frustration was evident in her voice. I'm only asking for a reservation for next week. Could I possibly speak with the manager about this? Before Victoria could respond, the manager, Elaine, appeared. She was the epitome of elegance, a woman in her mid-40s with a controlled demeanor that suggested she had dealt with her fair share of difficult situations. Elaine's gaze flickered over Emily for a fraction of a second before she spoke with an air of authority. Is there a problem here? She asked, directing the question at Victoria, though her eyes were fixed on Emily. Victoria immediately shifted into a more accommodating stance, though Emily noticed the forced politeness in her tone. This woman was just leaving, she said, almost too smoothly, her eyes darting toward Emily. Emily's jaw tightened. She wasn't going to be dismissed like this. Actually, she said, standing tall, I was simply trying to make a reservation. I'm not leaving until I speak to someone who can help me. Her voice was steady, but the fire in her chest was unmistakable now. Elaine's expression remained calm, but there was something cold behind her gaze. Madam, she said, her voice losing its initial warmth, I must insist that you leave. You're disturbing our guests. Her words felt like a slap to the face. How was asking for a reservation disturbing anyone? From a table across the room, Richard Hammond's voice rang out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people need to be told twice, he said, his tone laced with amusement as he leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The other patrons in the restaurant had started to pay attention, some of them glancing at the exchange with mild interest, while others seemed to hold back their smiles, some even turning their attention back to their meals, as if this kind of behavior was normal. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to let her embarrassment show. She wasn't going to back down now. Not when she had come so far to try and make this evening work. "I'm simply trying to make a reservation," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Why is that such a problem?" Elaine's patience seemed to be wearing thin. "Madam, either you leave voluntarily, or I'll have you escorted out," she said, her voice lowering into a tone that was meant to intimidate. The words stung. Emily's mind raced, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. "You're actually going to throw me out?" she asked, her disbelief growing. "For simply trying to make a reservation? While dressed comfortably?" Elaine's eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is a high-end establishment," she said, as if the words themselves explained everything. "We maintain a certain atmosphere here. Our guests expect a certain level of professionalism, both from the staff and the people who dine here." The implication was clear: Emily didn't fit that mold. And the more she heard, the angrier she became. She had never been a fan of exclusivity based on appearance, but this? This was something else. It felt personal now. "And what exactly do you mean by professionalism?" Emily asked, her voice steady but her eyes challenging. "Because from where I stand, it looks like it's based entirely on appearance and nothing else." The moment her words left her lips, the room seemed to grow quieter. Elaine looked visibly uncomfortable, and the silence between them stretched on for a beat longer than it should have. Emily didn't care about the discomfort of the staff. This wasn't about them. This was about the injustice that had been silently accepted for far too long. "Madam," Elaine started, her tone sharp again, "I suggest you leave now, or we will be forced to call security." Emily's eyes narrowed. She had had enough. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "Not without someone explaining to me how it's acceptable to treat a paying customer like this simply because they're not wearing designer clothes." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet but undeniable strength. Before the situation could escalate further, a young man approached, his suit not quite as sharp as the others, but still professionally cut. His expression was apologetic, his eyes uncomfortable. "Ma'am, if you could please come with me," he said, his voice hesitant. "I'm sorry, but the manager's orders are clear." Emily looked him in the eye, refusing to move. She wasn't about to let this go. "Is this really what you want to be a part of?" she asked, her voice soft, but her gaze unwavering. The young man faltered. I'm just doing my job, ma'am," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable. He stepped a little closer, hesitant to touch her, but his hand hovered near her elbow, a subtle gesture meant to guide her toward the door. Emily didn't move. "You're doing your job," she repeated slowly. "But you're also complicit in something wrong." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and laden with truth. The evening air felt unexpectedly cool against Emily's flushed cheeks as she stood outside the Crystal Palace. The sting of humiliation still burned in her chest, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. As she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from James. He'd just finished his meeting early and was on his way to the restaurant. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to arrive so soon. The timing was all wrong. What was meant to be a sweet surprise for their anniversary had turned into a public spectacle of judgment. Emily glanced back at the restaurant, where she could still see Victoria and Elaine exchanging quiet, satisfied glances as if they had just done something noble. She quickly typed a response to James, "I'll be outside. Please don't come in. I'll explain later." A wave of frustration washed over her. Why had this happened? How had the simple act of making a reservation turned into a nightmare? She could still hear Richard Hammond's cruel words ringing in her ears, the way he had looked down at her as though she were beneath him. People wait months for reservations. They dress appropriately. He had dismissed her without a second thought, and now she could feel the sharp edges of those words embedded in her chest. It wasn't just the humiliation, no, it was something deeper. Something more personal. Being judged for her clothes, for her appearance, felt like being judged for who she was. Emily shook her head, trying to push those thoughts aside. Focus, she told herself. She had to remind herself that she didn't care what these people thought. She didn't care about their standards. She had spent years teaching art to children who had so little, yet she had never judged anyone for what they wore or where they came from. She had always believed that it was the content of a person's character that mattered, not the outer shell they wore. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distinctive sound of an engine purring down the street. Her heart leapt into her throat as the sleek black Porsche 911 rounded the corner, its polished surface gleaming in the soft streetlight. She would recognize that car anywhere. James's Porsche. The car slowed to a stop just in front of the restaurant, and the world seemed to slow down around Emily. She could feel the tension in her body, the need to warn him, to stop him from walking into this storm. But it was too late. He was already out of the car, and she could see the confusion on his face as his eyes scanned the restaurant's entrance, looking for her. Emily stood frozen, watching him. He looked every bit the successful, confident man he was, a man who had built something from nothing, someone whose name carried weight in Boston's business circles. And yet, in that moment, it wasn't his accomplishments or his wealth that mattered. It was the way he looked at her as if searching for an answer to a question she hadn't been prepared to answer. The door to the restaurant opened, and James stepped inside. He was greeted by Victoria with her practiced smile, though there was a visible hesitation in her eyes as she assessed him. He was wearing his usual evening attire, his dark suit perfectly tailored to his frame, a crisp white shirt, and a tie that exuded quiet wealth. But Emily knew that none of this mattered now. Not after everything that had just happened. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, and a new wave of anger bubbled up inside her. She quickly walked over to the door, pushing it open just enough to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. The glow of the chandeliers was warm against the cool night air, but inside the Crystal Palace, it felt more like a stage set for a drama that she hadn't asked to be a part of. James was now at the podium with Victoria, and Emily could see that something had shifted. Victoria, who had once dismissed her with cold professionalism, was now watching James with a different expression. One that was tinged with uncertainty. Emily knew the moment James stepped inside, everything would change. She had no idea how, but she knew. She didn't even have to see the reaction from the rest of the room to know that they would now be paying attention. James's voice broke through the air, calm but firm. "I'm meeting my wife," he said, and for a split second Emily saw Victoria falter. The effect of his words was immediate. He hadn't even finished the sentence when Victoria's smile wavered. It was subtle, but Emily saw it. She saw it as clearly as she could see the cold determination in James's eyes. Victoria straightened, her professional mask quickly settling back into place, but Emily could see that something had shifted. The room had begun to react, and the staff, so confident just moments ago, were now uncertain, unsettled. James's presence had changed everything. James's gaze moved quickly over the restaurant, sweeping past the elegant tables and well-dressed patrons. He looked for Emily, and the moment his eyes locked onto her outside the door, the confusion in his face vanished. Replaced by something far more intense. Determination. Emily could see him take a steadying breath, and she knew that whatever happened next, he would not stand idly by. Without missing a beat, James walked past Victoria, who was now attempting to regain her composure. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly, his voice carrying across the otherwise hushed room. Victoria's smile, once so assured, faltered as she looked up at him. "Good evening, sir." Welcome to the Crystal Palace, she began, though her voice had lost the practiced cheerfulness. Do you have a reservation? James didn't respond right away. His gaze shifted, briefly scanning the room before meeting Victoria's eyes. I'm meeting my wife, he said again, his voice level, but there was something sharp in it now, an edge that had begun to form with the tension in the air. Victoria hesitated, and for the first time, Emily saw the shift in the woman's demeanor. The professional, unfazed exterior she had been wearing now seemed less polished. Your wife? Victoria asked, her tone subtly more cautious than before. Yes, James replied. Her name's Emily Parker. The name landed in the air like a heavy stone. Victoria's expression changed almost imperceptibly, but Emily noticed it instantly. Her eyes widened slightly, and she stiffened. The name Parker carried weight in Boston, in their industry. James's company had been in the news multiple times, for good reason. He wasn't just a regular customer to this establishment. He was someone important. Victoria recovered quickly, but her composure had slipped just enough to show the cracks. I'm sorry, Mr. Parker, she said, her voice a little more reserved. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Perhaps I can assist you with a reservation. Her words were now laced with an unfamiliar form of politeness, the kind one reserved for someone they suddenly realized was of importance. Emily felt her heart tighten in her chest. She watched as James stepped forward, his presence like a wall, silent but overwhelming. She knew he wasn't one to cause a scene. He never liked confrontation. But tonight, this moment, was different. The injustice of how she had been treated, how people like her were treated, had set him into motion. And she wasn't about to stop him. Why don't we talk about the reservation inside? James said, his tone still calm but carrying an undeniable authority now. He wasn't asking. It was a statement. Victoria, now visibly flustered, nodded and turned to lead them in. As they walked inside, Emily could feel the eyes of every single person in the restaurant following them. The hushed murmurs grew louder, as though the room had suddenly realized something was happening, something they hadn't expected, or perhaps something they didn't want to believe. Emily's steps faltered slightly as she entered the space she had once cherished so much. The chandeliers above were still as stunning as she remembered, but tonight, they felt cold, casting harsh light on everything that had just unfolded. The noise from the restaurant seemed to fade as they moved toward the center of the room. At their table, Richard Hammond, who had been quietly watching from the corner, stood up, clearly shocked by what was happening. His earlier smug satisfaction melted away as he saw who was entering. Emily could feel his gaze on them, sharp and uninviting. The air between them thickened with tension. James, however, didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on Victoria and the situation at hand. I'm sure you're aware of who we are, but just to be clear, he began, his voice smooth, yet heavy with the weight of his words, my wife, Emily Parker, has been a part of the Boston community for years. She's an art teacher who's dedicated her life to working with underprivileged children. She may not wear a designer dress, but that doesn't make her any less deserving of respect. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the standards the restaurant had clearly been holding up. Emily watched the scene unfold, a mixture of awe and discomfort filling her. This wasn't how she had imagined their evening going. Not even close. At this point, the manager, Elaine, finally approached, her posture stiff and formal as she addressed James. Mr. Parker, she began, but James didn't let her finish. I don't believe you understand, he said, cutting her off smoothly. This isn't just about a reservation. It's about how your establishment chooses to treat people. You have clear standards, and I'm starting to see what those are. The weight of his words seemed to settle over the restaurant. The staff who had once been bustling around the room now paused in their tracks. The silence was almost suffocating. For a moment, Emily didn't know what to do. She wasn't used to this kind of confrontation. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially for something like this. But then, she saw James's face. His determination wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had ever been looked down upon simply because they didn't fit into some arbitrary mold. And in that moment, Emily knew he wasn't about to let this go. Richard Hammond, who had been watching the scene unfold from his table, seemed to realize the situation was spiraling out of his control. His usual air of superiority had faltered, and Emily could see the discomfort in his eyes. But before he could speak, James turned to him. "Mr. Hammond," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "I'm curious, what exactly do you think makes someone worthy of respect?" Hammond's eyes narrowed, and his smug smile began to fade. "What's this about?" he sneered, clearly unprepared for the question. "This is a place for people who appreciate the finer things in life. If you can't understand that..." James held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "It's not about what you wear, Mr. Hammond. It's about who you are and what you bring to the table. And from where I stand, this place doesn't seem to value people based on that." The tension in the Crystal Palace was palpable, hanging thick in the air like smoke. Every eye in the room seemed to be on James and Emily, as if their presence had turned the elegant restaurant into a stage for an impromptu drama. Emily could feel the weight of the stairs pressing down on her, and for the first time in years, she wanted nothing more than to disappear. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not for something like this. She hadn't wanted a confrontation, she'd only wanted to make a reservation for a simple anniversary dinner. But now, with James standing tall beside her, the situation had escalated in a way she could never have imagined. The fine dining atmosphere had transformed into a battlefield of sorts. The calm, polished voices of the staff seemed to blur in the background as James's words carried a weight of authority that was impossible to ignore. "Let's talk to the manager," James said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the restaurant like a knife. His hand, warm and steady, rested on the small of Emily's back as they moved further into the room. She could feel his presence like an anchor in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Victoria, still visibly shaken from their earlier exchange, stepped forward as if on cue, leading them toward the back of the restaurant where the manager, Elaine, had been observing from a distance. Emily noticed that Elaine's usually polished demeanor seemed to falter just slightly as she approached, and for a moment, Emily saw something in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or uncertainty. It was fleeting, but it was there. "Mr. Parker, I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding," Elaine began, her voice tight, but her professionalism still evident. "We simply didn't realize who Mrs. Parker was." James's expression remained cool, but Emily could see the muscles in his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. "Is that really how you run your establishment?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Judging people based on their appearance instead of who they are?" Elaine's face flushed slightly, but she recovered quickly, smoothing her uniform as she tried to regain control of the situation. "It's not about appearance, Mr. Parker," she said, her tone a little defensive. "We have standards to maintain here, standards that our guests expect." Emily could feel the anger rising in her chest again. This wasn't about standards, it was about discrimination, plain and simple. The idea that people were judged based on how they looked, rather than what they brought to the table, was maddening to her. And the fact that it was happening right here, in a place she had once held in high regard, made it even worse. "I understand that you have certain expectations," James said, his voice calm but still carrying that underlying edge, "but no one should be judged by what they wear. Not here. Not anywhere." Elaine hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line as she tried to think of a way to salvage the situation. It was clear she wasn't used to being confronted like this, and Emily couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction at seeing the usually confident manager flounder. Elaine began, but before she could continue, a voice interrupted from across the room. "Some people just don't know their place," Richard Hammond sneered, his voice carrying through the restaurant as if he were announcing a point of fact. "This is a fine establishment, not some casual diner. Standards are what keep places like this from going downhill." The room fell silent as every eye turned toward Hammond, who was lounging in his seat, a smug expression on his face. Emily felt a surge of indignation course through her. How dare he? She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she would be able to stay composed. James's gaze flicked over to Hammond, and for a moment, Emily thought he might say something. But then, his expression shifted, and the corner of his mouth quirked up in a small, almost imperceptible smile. Without a word, he turned back to Elaine, who was still standing stiffly in front of them. "I don't think you understand," James said calmly. "My wife wasn't trying to dine here tonight. She was simply trying to make a reservation for next week, for our anniversary. And now, because of how she was treated, I don't think we'll be dining here at all." The silence that followed felt suffocating. It was as though the room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her eyes trained on the floor, unwilling to let the anger show on her face. She hadn't wanted any of this. She had only wanted a quiet evening, a chance to celebrate the life they had built together. But instead, she was stuck in this mess, caught between the expectations of a society that valued the superficial over everything else. Elaine's voice broke the silence, sounding more desperate now. "Mr. Parker, I assure you, there has been a misunderstanding. I will personally see to it that your reservation is handled immediately." But James shook his head, his expression no longer one of polite indifference. "It's too late for that," he said quietly, and Emily could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air like an irreversible decision. The tension was palpable as the moment dragged on, with the entire restaurant hanging on the outcome of the confrontation. Richard Hammond's eyes darted between James and Elaine, his smug confidence beginning to slip as he realized the direction the evening was taking. The energy in the room had shifted, and it was now impossible for anyone to ignore the scene unfolding before them. For the first time, Hammond looked uncomfortable, his usual self-assurance faltering as he began to grasp the gravity of the situation. James stood firm, his gaze unwavering as he faced the staff. "This isn't just about my wife being turned away. This is about how your establishment chooses to treat people who don't fit into your narrow idea of what's acceptable," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience in handling tough situations. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his words. The injustice had lit a fire in him, and he wasn't about to let it die down. Elaine opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her usual smooth professionalism had crumbled, replaced by the desperate attempt to salvage what was left of her carefully curated image. The restaurant had always prided itself on exclusivity, but now that very exclusivity felt like a cage, a barrier that excluded people based on nothing more than appearances. "And let's talk about those standards you mentioned earlier," James continued, his voice steady and filled with quiet authority. "What standards are you really upholding here? The kind that turn away people like my wife, who happens to be dressed comfortably, because they don't measure up to your idea of who belongs?" Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had never expected James to step in like this. In all their years together, she had always seen him as someone who preferred to avoid conflict, someone whose influence was subtle and quiet. But tonight, something had shifted. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for a broader idea, an idea of inclusivity, fairness, and kindness. It was the same belief that had made him so passionate about his work in sustainable energy, an idea that had propelled him forward in his career and in life. Elaine's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the reservation book in front of her, trying to buy herself some time. "Mr. Parker," she began again, her voice much quieter now, "I understand your frustration. But we have a certain clientele." "Let's get one thing straight," James interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like a knife. "You're not dealing with clients here. You're dealing with people. Real people. And real people shouldn't have to jump through hoops just to be treated with basic dignity." As the last of his words sank in, the room fell into complete silence. No one seemed to know how to react. Some diners sat frozen in their seats, unsure of what to do or say. Others looked uncomfortably down at their plates, clearly wanting to avoid being pulled into the drama. Emily noticed a few of the staff glancing at each other, as if they were unsure of how to handle the situation. They had never seen anything like this happen at the Crystal Palace before. James took a step back, his expression softening slightly as he turned toward Emily, his hand gently resting on her arm. "I don't want to make a scene," he said quietly, his voice for her alone. "But I won't let this go." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." But as they prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. From across the room, an elderly couple slowly rose from their table, their movements deliberate and dignified. The woman, dressed in understated but elegant evening wear, made her way toward James and Emily. Her husband followed behind her, his posture upright but weary, as though the years of watching this same kind of thing unfold had weighed on him. "You know," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of decades in Boston's high society, "we've been coming to this restaurant for years. 20, to be exact." She turned to face the staff, her eyes sharp. "And in all that time, we've seen this place change. It used to be about the people who walked through the door, the character they brought with them. But now, it seems it's about who can pay the most and wear the most expensive clothes. I think we've seen enough." Her husband nodded in agreement, his voice a soft but firm affirmation. "We won't be back." For a moment, the room stood still. It was as if the entire atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted in an instant. The realization of what had just happened, the acknowledgement of what they had all witnessed, had reached the people in the room who had been complicit, who had remained silent. James's eyes flicked from the elderly couple back to Elaine, who was now standing rigidly, her face flushed with embarrassment. He had seen this kind of thing before, not in restaurants, but in boardrooms, in meetings, in places where people thought they could get away with making others feel small. But it was different now. The tables had turned, and it was clear that the Crystal Palace would never be the same in the eyes of the people who had witnessed what had just unfolded. Richard Hammond, realizing that the tide was turning against him, stood up from his table, his chair scraping noisily against the floor. He glanced nervously between the elderly couple, James, and the others who were now beginning to murmur among themselves. His usual swagger was nowhere to be found. "Now, hold on," Hammond began, trying to salvage his position, but his voice lacked the strength it had earlier. "This is all a bit excessive, don't you think?" The woman turned to him, her gaze icy. "Excessive," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "No, Mr. Hammond. What's excessive is how this place has treated people like Mrs. Parker here. People who deserve the same respect you get, no matter what they wear." Hammond sputtered, clearly caught off guard by her response. I didn't mean it like that." "Well, it certainly sounded like you did," the man said, his voice firm. "And it's time someone called it out." The next morning, Emily woke to the soft chirping of birds outside their bedroom window. She had barely slept the night before, her mind still reeling from the events at the Crystal Palace. Despite the relief she felt from James standing by her, defending her, she couldn't shake the unease that lingered in her chest. The humiliation from the night before had been sharp, but what hurt even more was how easily the restaurant staff had dismissed her. It wasn't just about the reservation, it was about what she represented to them, a person who didn't belong in their world. As she lay there, tangled in the sheets, Emily couldn't help but think of the elderly couple who had stood up for them. Their support had been a rare glimpse of kindness in a world that often seemed to favor the wealthy and powerful. She thought about what the woman had said, it used to be about character. Had she been wrong in believing that things could change? Maybe people in places like the Crystal Palace didn't care about character anymore. They cared about appearances, about the money someone had or didn't have, about whether someone was worthy of being seen at all. But no. She refused to believe that. She couldn't. Not after everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. "I am not invisible," she told herself firmly, pushing the thoughts aside. She needed to focus on something positive, something that mattered. The sound of footsteps approached the bedroom door, followed by a soft knock. Emily?" James's voice called gently from the other side. "Are you awake?" "Yeah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She pushed herself up from the bed, brushing her hair out of her face as she walked toward the door. When she opened it, James was standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. The sight of him, so calm and steady, made her heart soften. His eyes met hers, filled with quiet concern. "I thought you could use some coffee," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Thanks," Emily murmured, taking the cup gratefully. She sipped the hot liquid, feeling the warmth spread through her hands. It was a small gesture, but it felt grounding, like a moment of peace in the midst of everything that had happened. James stepped inside the room, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle but tinged with an underlying seriousness. Emily hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just keep thinking about last night. How easily they treated me like I didn't belong. Like I was just invisible." Her voice wavered slightly, and she quickly took another sip of her coffee, trying to steady herself. James reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're not invisible, Em. Not to me, and certainly not to anyone who matters." His words were simple, but there was a depth to them that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "But it's hard to let go of that feeling. The way they looked at me, the way they talked down to me. I know it shouldn't matter, but it does. It makes me question everything." James nodded, his thumb brushing over her hand. "I understand. But you can't let them define your worth. You've built a life, a career, that's based on your heart and your passion. You've helped so many people, Emily. That's who you are. That's what matters." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. "And what about the world outside? The way people judge us based on what we wear or how much money we have. How do we fight that?" He paused for a moment, thinking carefully before answering. "One step at a time," he said softly. "By being the person you are. By showing others that there's more to life than what they can see on the surface. We can't change everyone's mind, but we can change the way we choose to respond." His words gave her a sense of clarity, a new perspective she hadn't considered before. Emily had always prided herself on her ability to help others, to teach her students the importance of self-expression and self-worth. But now, it was time to remind herself of those lessons. "I can't let this define me," she thought. A sudden thought struck her, and she looked at James with a spark of determination. "You know, I think I know what we need to do next." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" Emily smiled, the weight in her chest easing for the first time since the previous night. "We need to find a place that actually values people. Where the food is great, the atmosphere is real, and the people who run it care more about the experience than the appearance. We need to remind ourselves why we fell in love with each other in the first place." James's face broke into a grin, and for the first time that morning, Emily felt like a weight had been lifted. "I think that sounds perfect," he said, standing up. "Let's make it happen." Emily and James decided to take the day to step away from the chaos and uncertainty that had filled their lives the previous evening. The incident at the Crystal Palace still lingered in their minds, but they were determined to create a new memory, one that celebrated who they were, not who others thought they should be. They set out to find a place that reflected their values, somewhere that welcomed them for who they were, without judgment. As they walked through the bustling streets of New York City, James squeezed Emily's hand, the familiar gesture grounding her in the present. It was rare for them to have time alone like this, away from the pressures of work and the constant rush of their busy lives. Today felt different, like a chance to rediscover what mattered most. They passed by several upscale restaurants, but none of them felt right. They were all too polished, too controlled. Emily could still picture the glass chandeliers and starched white tablecloths of the Crystal Palace, a place that had once seemed so enchanting, now tarnished by the way they had been treated. They wanted something more than elegance for the sake of status. They wanted warmth, authenticity. How about that one? Emily asked, pointing to a small, cozy bistro tucked between two buildings. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but there was something about it, a warmth that seemed to radiate from the window, where the soft glow of candlelight danced inside. James glanced at it, then back at Emily. "It looks perfect," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "Let's give it a try." They walked inside, the soft chime of a bell above the door marking their entrance. The air was filled with the earthy scent of freshly baked bread and simmering herbs. The sound of laughter and conversation bubbled around them, and the atmosphere was a far cry from the stiff formality of the Crystal Palace. Here, there was no pretense, no sense of exclusivity. Just people enjoying a meal, sharing stories, and savoring the simple joy of being together. A young woman greeted them with a warm smile. "Table for two?" she asked, her voice friendly and welcoming. "Yes, please," Emily said, her nerves slowly unwinding as she followed the hostess through the small dining area. They were seated at a wooden table near the back, surrounded by mismatched chairs that added to the homey, unpretentious vibe of the place. The menu was handwritten on chalkboards, and the waiter arrived quickly, offering them both a glass of wine. Emily took a sip, savoring the rich flavor, and felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth. This was what she had been searching for, a place where the experience wasn't defined by appearances, but by the people and the connections they made. As they settled into their seats, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. The events at the Crystal Palace had shaken her confidence, made her question whether people would ever see beyond surface-level judgments. But here, in this unassuming bistro, she felt like herself again. No one was looking at her clothes or scrutinizing her presence. They were simply enjoying the moment. "So," James said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "how about we focus on what really matters today? No more worrying about what anyone else thinks." Emily nodded, a genuine laugh escaping her lips. "That sounds perfect. No more trying to fit into someone else's idea of who we should be." James reached across the table, taking her hand in his once more. "We've built something real, Em. Something that matters. And no one can take that away from us." As she looked into his eyes, Emily felt a sense of clarity. All the pressure, all the expectations, seemed to melt away. This was what truly mattered, the love they shared, the life they were building together, and the belief that their worth wasn't determined by anything but the depth of their connection. They spent the next few hours enjoying the simple pleasures of life, a delicious meal, good conversation, and the quiet joy of being together without the weight of the world on their shoulders. It wasn't about extravagance or exclusivity. It was about the beauty of the moment, and the comfort of knowing that they were enough, just as they were. As the meal came to a close, James leaned back in his chair and smiled at Emily. "This was exactly what we needed," he said. "I feel like we've been reminded of what's important." Emily smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't agree more." They paid the bill and walked out into the cool evening air, their hearts lighter than they had been in days. The noise of the city surrounded them, but it no longer felt overwhelming. They were no longer weighed down by the expectations of others. Instead, they walked side by side, content in the knowledge that they were creating their own path, one that didn't require anyone's approval but their own. As they headed home, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would continue to fight for what mattered, their love, their values, and the belief that true worth came from within. And as long as they had each other, that was all they would ever need. The next few days passed in a blur for Emily. After the emotional whirlwind at the Crystal Palace, she had tried to push the incident from her mind, focusing on her work and her students. She loved teaching art at the local community center. It was a place where people weren't judged by their clothes or wealth. It was about creativity, expression, and connection. And it was where she felt most at home. But the thoughts of the restaurant, the way she had been treated, and the words Richard Hammond had so carelessly thrown at her still lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had been awakened. It wasn't just about the rejection from the restaurant, it was the realization that there were so many others who probably faced the same thing every day. People who were judged based on the way they looked, their status, or their bank accounts. Emily knew she couldn't let this go. She didn't want to become like the people at the Crystal Palace, dismissing others for reasons beyond their control. She wanted to do something. She just didn't know where to start. It was then that she received an unexpected message from Thomas, the young server who had escorted her out of the restaurant. His words were simple, but they struck her deeply. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how you were treated. I've been thinking about it ever since. If you ever need help with anything, I'd be glad to assist. I don't believe anyone should be treated like that." Emily felt a mix of emotions, surprise, gratitude, and a sense of hope. She hadn't expected someone like Thomas to reach out. After all, he was just doing his job, and he could have easily turned a blind eye to what had happened. But his message showed her that not everyone agreed with how things had gone down at the restaurant. There were still good people out there, people who understood that everyone deserved respect, regardless of their appearance. She decided to respond. "Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate your words more than you know. I hope you're doing well." As the days passed, Emily continued to think about the situation. What had happened at the Crystal Palace was more than just a personal affront, it was a symptom of something much larger. A divide between people who felt they belonged and those who didn't. A divide between those who were seen and those who were invisible. And it wasn't just in places like the Crystal Palace, it was everywhere. One evening, as she sat at her pottery wheel, the idea hit her. She had spent so many years teaching art, encouraging her students to express themselves, to break free from the boundaries that society often placed on them. But she had never used her platform to truly challenge the system that created those boundaries. What if she could do something to give people like her, like Thomas, a voice? What if she could create something that not only challenged societal standards, but also celebrated people for who they were, not what they wore or how much money they had? The thought excited her, but it was also terrifying. What if no one cared? What if it didn't make a difference? But as she sat there, her hands covered in clay, she realized that it didn't matter. She had to try. She had to take that first step, no matter how uncertain it seemed. She picked up her phone and sent a message to James. "I have an idea. I want to create something, a project that highlights the value of people beyond their appearance. I think we can make a real difference." She didn't know exactly how it would work, but she felt certain that this was the next step in her journey. And James, as always, was ready to support her. His response came quickly. "Whatever it is, I'm in. Let's make it happen." The next few weeks were filled with brainstorming, meetings, and planning. Emily reached out to Thomas, who was more than willing to help. Together, they came up with an idea for a community art project, a public exhibition that showcased people from all walks of life. They wanted to highlight the beauty of diversity, to show the world that people's worth wasn't tied to their outward appearance, but to the things that truly mattered, their character, their kindness, their ability to love and connect. They called it The Real You. The project would feature portraits of people who had been judged or marginalized by society, capturing their true essence. The goal was to show that everyone had a story worth telling, a face that deserved to be seen, and a life that deserved to be valued. Emily was excited, but she was also nervous. This was more than just a personal project, it was a statement. It was a challenge to the very systems that had tried to diminish her and others like her. But with every step forward, she felt more certain. This was what she had been waiting for. As the weeks passed, Emily, James, and Thomas worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. The project, The Real You, began to take shape, starting with a call for participants. They reached out to local community centers, shelters, schools, and various organizations to invite people who had been judged based on their appearance or socioeconomic status to be part of the exhibition. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life, from single mothers to immigrants, from young children to elderly individuals, came forward to share their stories. Emily was touched by the courage of these individuals, many of whom had been reluctant to show their true selves to the world. But through the project, they began to see that their worth wasn't determined by how others perceived them. The portraits themselves were powerful, each image told a unique story. Some subjects smiled brightly, their eyes filled with warmth and hope, while others had a more somber expression, reflecting the struggles they had faced. The goal was not to create idealized representations of these people, but to capture their raw, unfiltered selves, their triumphs, their pain, their strength. Emily was both the curator and the artist behind the project, using her skills in photography and painting to bring the portraits to life. As she worked, she found herself connecting with each person she photographed. The stories they shared with her were heartbreaking, but they also filled her with a sense of purpose. She was reminded, time and again, that the real beauty of a person didn't come from how they looked or what they wore. It came from their resilience, their kindness, and the ability to continue moving forward despite the obstacles life threw their way. James played a crucial role as well, using his connections and resources to secure a location for the exhibition. They found a community gallery that was willing to host the event, and with James's help, they were able to fund the costs and promote the exhibition to a wider audience. The day of the exhibition arrived, and Emily felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The gallery was filled with light, the walls adorned with the faces of the participants, each one a testament to the project's mission. As the visitors slowly trickled in, Emily watched their reactions. Some were quiet, taking in the portraits with reverence. Others whispered to each other, moved by the stories displayed before them. But what touched Emily most was the response of the participants themselves. Many of them had never imagined that their faces, their stories, would be displayed in such an important setting. They stood proudly next to their portraits, their eyes shining with pride. Emily watched as a mother and daughter embraced in front of their portrait, a young man shared his story with a group of visitors, and a woman who had once been too shy to speak stood tall, her face filled with confidence. The exhibition was a success in ways that Emily hadn't anticipated. Not only had it provided a platform for those who had often been overlooked, but it had also sparked conversations in the community about the importance of looking beyond appearances. It was a reminder that every person had value, no matter where they came from or how they were perceived by society. As the night wore on and the gallery began to empty, Emily stood next to James, her heart full. They had done it. They had created something that mattered, something that could potentially change the way people saw one another. "This is just the beginning," Emily said, her voice soft but filled with determination. "We've started something important here." James nodded, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "You've made a real difference. And I have no doubt this is just the start of something much bigger." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had found her purpose again, not in seeking approval from the crystal palaces of the world, but in creating a space where people could be seen for who they truly were. She had learned, in the process, that it wasn't about fitting into someone else's idea of success or beauty. It was about defining success on her own terms, and helping others do the same. And as they left the gallery that night, hand in hand, Emily knew that this was only the beginning. There was more work to be done, more people to reach, and more lives to touch. But she was ready. Ready to take on the world, one portrait at a time. The days following the exhibition were a whirlwind for Emily. The Real You project had exceeded all of her expectations. It wasn't just the overwhelming response from the community that had left her feeling invigorated, it was the realization that people were finally starting to pay attention, really pay attention, to what mattered. The messages she received from participants, supporters, and even strangers were heartfelt and powerful. Many expressed how moved they were by the portraits, the stories, and the vulnerability shared by everyone involved. But Emily knew that the work wasn't over. The exhibition was just the first step in what she hoped would become a broader movement, a movement that would challenge people's perceptions and encourage them to look beyond the surface. One morning, as Emily sat in her studio sipping coffee, she received a call from an unexpected source, Elaine, the manager from the Crystal Palace. Emily hesitated for a moment before picking up, unsure of what to expect. After the way Elaine had treated her that night, she wasn't sure how this conversation would go. "Hello, Mrs. Parker," Elaine's voice came through the receiver, sounding more subdued than Emily remembered. "I wanted to reach out to you personally to apologize for the way you were treated at the restaurant. I've been reflecting on the events of that night, and I realize how wrong we were to judge you based on your appearance. It was unprofessional, and frankly, it was disgraceful." Emily was taken aback by the sincerity in Elaine's voice. She had expected a more defensive tone, but this sounded different, like genuine remorse. For a moment, she was unsure how to respond. The experience had been painful, and while she had moved past it, part of her still felt raw about the way she had been dismissed so easily. "Thank you for calling," Emily said after a beat, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your apology. It means more than you might think. But I do have to say, what happened wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of a much larger issue. A problem that runs deeper than one restaurant." Elaine paused, as if contemplating her words. "I understand," she replied, her tone more thoughtful now. "I've come to realize that the way we judge people, based on what they wear, how they look, or their social status, has no place in any part of our society. I'm working with the Crystal Palace management team to make changes. We're looking at ways to better serve all people, not just the ones who fit a certain mold. I can't undo what happened, but I do want to do better." Emily was silent for a moment, considering her words carefully. "That's good to hear," she said finally. "But it's not just about the restaurant. This is about how society as a whole needs to change. People need to be seen for who they are, not what they look like." Elaine's voice softened. "I agree. And I want to be part of that change. I want the Crystal Palace to stand for something more than just exclusivity. I want it to represent inclusivity and diversity, values that should be present in every corner of our world." The conversation ended on a hopeful note, with Emily feeling cautiously optimistic about the possibility of real change, even in a place like the Crystal Palace. As much as the restaurant had once represented the exclusivity that had hurt her, there was now a chance for it to stand for something better. It wouldn't be an overnight transformation, but perhaps, with time, small changes could make a big difference. Later that day, Emily sat down with James to discuss the phone call. "Elaine reached out," she said, looking up from her notes. "She apologized for how things went down at the Crystal Palace. And, she seemed genuinely remorseful. She even mentioned making changes at the restaurant, focusing on inclusivity." James raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "That's unexpected," he said. "I didn't think someone like her would come around so quickly." "Neither did I," Emily admitted. "But maybe it's not about changing the people, it's about starting the conversation, showing that things can be different. If we can get others to see that, maybe real change is possible." James nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You've done something incredible, Em. You've started a conversation, and that's the first step toward making things better. It's bigger than you ever imagined, isn't it?" Emily smiled softly, feeling the weight of his words. "It is. And I think it's just the beginning." As the days passed, the momentum from the Real You project began to snowball. Emily's message of inclusivity, acceptance, and breaking down societal barriers spread further than she had initially anticipated. People were talking about it. In the local media, on social platforms, and even in cafes and offices around the city, the Real You was making waves. Emily had always known that her work had the potential to inspire change, but seeing it unfold in real time was both humbling and overwhelming. The voices she had once tried to elevate were now being heard by people who would otherwise have overlooked them. They were seen, not for their clothes, their wealth, or their status, but for who they truly were. A few weeks after the exhibition, Emily received another unexpected call. This time it was from the board of the Parker Innovation Foundation, a philanthropic organization that James was heavily involved with. Emily knew the foundation supported numerous initiatives, particularly in the areas of education and social justice. When the board invited her to discuss partnering with them on a new project, she was both flattered and excited. The call had come just as she was finalizing plans to continue expanding the Real You initiative. She had already begun organizing a larger exhibition for the following spring, but the idea of working with the foundation was an incredible opportunity. It was a chance to scale the project, to bring it to more people and impact a wider community. The possibilities were endless, and Emily knew this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. That afternoon, she sat down with James to discuss the offer. "I never expected to be on the radar of the foundation," she said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They want to partner with me, James. They want the Real You to be part of something bigger." James smiled, his eyes glowing with pride. "Of course they do. You've created something powerful. You're changing people's minds and showing them a different way to see the world." "But it's not just about me," Emily responded. "It's about the people in these portraits, the ones who were told they weren't enough, that they didn't belong. This project is about giving them a voice." James nodded. "And that's why it's so important. You're not just doing art, Emily. You're doing something that can shift the way people view themselves and each other." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, planning sessions, and ideas that flowed faster than Emily could keep up with. The foundation had an incredible network of supporters and resources, and soon, the Real You was being featured at their annual gala. The exhibition would be part of their new campaign to fund arts programs in underserved communities, helping to bridge the gap between art and social justice. Emily was thrilled, but the pressure to make it all work weighed heavily on her. She had always worked with limited resources, relying on her own skills and determination to make things happen. But now, with the foundation's backing, the stakes felt higher. She had to ensure that every detail was perfect, that every participant felt honored and seen in the way they deserved. The foundation's support came with a lot of attention, but Emily was determined not to lose sight of what made the Real You so special. She wanted to keep the heart of the project intact, the raw honesty, the diversity, and the voices of those who had been marginalized. As the deadline for the gala approached, Emily found herself working around the clock, pushing herself to the limit. She was exhausted, but she couldn't stop. This was her chance to make a lasting impact, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. A week before the gala, Emily and James found themselves sitting together in their living room, looking over the final plans for the exhibition. The weight of the project had started to feel like too much, but as James held her hand, she found some comfort in his presence. He knew how much this meant to her. "You're doing amazing things, James said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "This exhibition is going to change lives." She smiled, but there was a tiredness in her eyes. "I just want to make sure I do it right. I want these people to feel proud, to know they're being seen for who they really are." James leaned forward, his hand gently squeezing hers. "You already have, Emily. You've given them a chance to tell their story. That's more than most people ever get." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in her heart. She was doing the right thing. She was making a difference, even if it was one step at a time. And with James by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The night of the gala arrived, and Emily stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the faces of those who had inspired her most. The portraits were displayed in elegant frames, each one a testament to the resilience of the individuals who had agreed to share their stories with the world. As guests mingled, Emily felt a quiet pride. This was more than just an exhibition. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change the way the world viewed itself. The gala was a success beyond anything Emily could have imagined. As the evening unfolded, she watched in awe as people crowded around the portraits, moved by the stories and the raw emotion captured in every photograph. There was an energy in the room, a palpable sense of connection, as guests marveled at the power of the project and the courage of the individuals who had opened themselves up to be seen. Emily stood off to the side, her heart swelling with pride. This was more than just an art exhibition, it was a testament to the people who had dared to share their vulnerabilities, to show their true selves. The event had raised significant funds for arts programs in underserved communities, but it had also ignited a conversation about the importance of inclusivity and the need to challenge societal norms. James had been by her side the entire night, offering words of encouragement and support whenever she needed it. She was grateful for his unwavering belief in her, for his constant reminder that the work she was doing was making a difference, even when the road ahead felt uncertain. As the night began to wind down, Emily felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Elaine standing behind her, a nervous but sincere look on her face. The woman had been more reserved than usual, but now, she seemed almost hesitant. "I just wanted to say again how much I admire what you've done here," Elaine said, her voice a little shaky. "The impact this has had. I honestly didn't realize how much change was possible, how much could be accomplished through art and storytelling. I've been thinking a lot about how we approach things at the restaurant. This is bigger than I ever imagined." Emily nodded, grateful but still a little taken aback. "Thank you, Elaine. I'm glad it resonated with you. But it's not just about art. It's about giving people a platform to tell their stories and be seen for who they really are." Elaine smiled, though her expression was tinged with something almost like regret. "I've been so caught up in the image of things, what people wear, how they look, that I've forgotten what really matters. It's something I'm working on changing, not just at the restaurant but in my own life." Emily could tell that the words meant something to her. For all the differences between them, they shared a mutual understanding now, a recognition that true change had to start from within. "Change takes time," Emily said gently. "But you're on the right path. And it's a good start." Elaine looked at her with gratitude before glancing around the room, clearly moved by the impact of the evening. "I want to be part of that change, Emily. I think the Crystal Palace can do better, and I want to help lead that change. This exhibition has opened my eyes." Emily smiled, touched by her sincerity. "I think you can make a difference. Everyone has the ability to." As Elaine walked away to join the rest of the guests, Emily's thoughts began to wander. She had come a long way since that night at the Crystal Palace, and the path ahead seemed clearer now. The work she was doing wasn't just about creating art, it was about challenging people's perceptions, helping them see the world and each other through a different lens. She knew that the journey was just beginning, and there was so much more to be done. Later, as the gala came to a close and the last guests filtered out, Emily and James lingered behind, savoring the quiet moments before they had to return to their hectic lives. They stood near one of the final portraits, taking in the faces of the participants, many of whom were already making their way out, proud of the legacy they had left. "You did it," James said, his voice low, filled with admiration. "This is exactly what you were meant to do." Emily smiled up at him, feeling the weight of the night's success settle in. "I couldn't have done it without you." James shook his head. "You had the vision. You made it happen. I'm just glad I could be part of it." They stood there for a moment, taking in the energy in the room. The evening had been everything Emily had hoped for, and more. But as she looked around, she knew that there was still work to be done. This was just one step in a much larger journey. "We need to keep going," Emily said, her voice steady with purpose. "We've started something here, but there's still so much more to do. This is just the beginning." James's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Then let's keep going." In the weeks following the gala, Emily's life seemed to accelerate. What had started as a small idea, the real you, was now a full-blown movement. There were discussions with schools, non-profits, and even corporate organizations that wanted to partner with her to help spread the message of inclusivity. She was constantly in meetings, refining the project and expanding its reach. The foundation's backing had given her the platform she needed, and now she was determined to make the most of it. James had been her rock throughout the process. While Emily juggled countless commitments, James worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using his connections to help get the project in front of people who could help make it even bigger. It was a partnership in every sense of the word. But with all the momentum came an underlying pressure. Emily had never expected such a rapid expansion, and while she was excited, there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. One evening, as Emily sat at her kitchen table, sorting through emails and proposals, James walked in with a cup of coffee. He could see the exhaustion on her face, even though she was doing her best to hide it. "You've been working non-stop for hours," he said, gently placing the coffee in front of her. "When was the last time you took a break?" Emily sighed, rubbing her eyes. "I can't afford to take a break right now, James. There's so much to do. We have another exhibition coming up next month, and I'm still working with the foundation on their arts initiative. I don't know how to keep up." James sat down across from her, his expression soft but serious. "Emily, you need to find balance. This is important, yes, but you also need to take care of yourself. I can see how much it's taking out of you, and I'm worried." She leaned back in her chair, her shoulders sagging. "I know. I just feel like if I slow down now, everything will fall apart. I've worked so hard to get here, and I can't afford to let it slip through my fingers." James reached out and took her hand, his voice calm but firm. "You've already done so much. The work you've done has changed lives, Emily. But you don't have to do it all at once. It's okay to take a step back. We'll find a way to make it work, together." Emily looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. She had always been driven, but in the rush to create change, she had forgotten to give herself the space to breathe. She needed to remember why she started this project in the first place, not just for the world, but for herself too. "You're right," she said softly. "I've been so focused on the bigger picture that I've neglected the smaller moments. I don't want to lose sight of why I'm doing this." James smiled, squeezing her hand. "And you won't. We'll pace ourselves. We've come this far together, and we can keep going. But you have to let yourself rest, Emily. The world needs you, but so do you." The next morning, Emily took a step back. She rescheduled a few meetings and cancelled an upcoming event, giving herself permission to rest. It wasn't easy for her. She had always prided herself on her work ethic, on pushing through exhaustion for the greater good. But after talking with James, she realized that she couldn't give her best if she wasn't taking care of herself too. She spent the day in her studio, doing what she loved most, creating. She picked up her pottery tools and started molding a new piece, the soothing rhythm of her hands working with the clay calming her mind. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't just rushing to the next big thing. She was allowing herself to enjoy the present moment. That evening, when she sat down with James for dinner, she felt lighter, more centered. The world wasn't going to fall apart if she took a break. It would still be there when she was ready to dive back in, but now she knew that she needed to take care of herself, too. "I needed this," Emily said, looking across the table at James. "Thank you for helping me see that." James reached across the table and took her hand in his. "You don't have to thank me. You just needed to remember that you can't pour from an empty cup. I'm here for you, always." Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She wasn't alone in this journey. And as long as she had people like James by her side, she knew that the real you would continue to grow, but so would she. There was no rush, no finish line. This was a lifelong mission, one she would take step by step, moment by moment, learning and growing along the way. The morning after the decision to slow down, Emily felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in weeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, she woke up without the weight of deadlines pressing on her shoulders. Instead of diving straight into work, she decided to take a moment to simply be. She grabbed her coffee and sat on the balcony of their apartment, gazing out at the city skyline as the morning sun bathed everything in golden light. James had been right. She couldn't keep going at this pace and expect to be the best version of herself. She had always been driven, always been the one to push through exhaustion to get things done. But now, the idea of balance seemed almost foreign to her. Still, as she took a slow sip of coffee, Emily knew that if she wanted her work to continue having the impact it was, she had to take better care of herself. The realization didn't come easily, but it was starting to settle in. The world of inclusivity, the mission to challenge societal norms, had become a driving force for her. Yet she had been so focused on that mission that she had neglected her own needs. She had forgotten the importance of small moments of joy, like sitting quietly on the balcony and feeling the warmth of the sun. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to the present. It was a text from Thomas. "Emily, I've been thinking about how we can expand the Real You initiative. There are a few more people who want to be part of it, and I've had some other ideas I'd love to discuss. Let me know when you're free." Emily smiled. She appreciated Thomas's enthusiasm and drive. Over the past few weeks, he had become a key part of the project, bringing new perspectives and connecting with people from all walks of life. She typed back quickly, eager to reconnect. "Let's meet later today. I'm ready to start planning the next steps." She set the phone down and stood up, stretching her arms above her head. Today would be about balance. She knew that there was still so much to be done, but for once, she was going to take it slow. A walk through the park, maybe. Some time with James. She would pace herself, and for once, that felt like the right thing to do. Later that afternoon, after a peaceful walk and a quiet lunch, Emily met with Thomas at a local cafe. He was already sitting at a corner table, his laptop open, papers scattered around him as he jotted down notes. As soon as he saw her, his face lit up with excitement. "Emily. So good to see you. I've got so many ideas," he said, practically bouncing in his seat. Emily sat down across from him, smiling. "I'm glad you're excited, Thomas. Let's hear what you've got." Thomas pulled a notebook in front of him and began to outline his ideas. "Well, the first thing we need to do is think bigger. The exhibition we did with the gallery was incredible, but I think we can reach more people if we take this into schools and local community centers. We can host workshops and involve students in creating their own art projects that explore themes of identity, self-worth, and societal standards." Emily nodded thoughtfully, her mind already working through the possibilities. "I love that idea. It would make the project more interactive, more engaging for people who might not otherwise be exposed to it. We could tie in local artists to lead those workshops, create collaborations across different communities." "Exactly," Thomas said, his eyes gleaming. "And what if we also created an online platform where people could submit their own portraits and stories? We could expand the reach beyond our local community, letting others from all over share their experiences." Emily leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. An online platform, that could be huge. It would make the project truly global, giving voices to people who might not have access to traditional exhibition spaces. She felt a rush of excitement as the conversation flowed between them. Ideas began to spill out faster than they could write them down. Thomas was right, they could make this project much bigger than they had originally envisioned. They could turn it into a movement, reaching people who were craving a space where they could be seen for who they truly were. As the afternoon wore on, Emily and Thomas continued to brainstorm, their ideas flowing seamlessly as they built on each other's thoughts. By the time they finished, they had a rough outline of how to move forward with the Real You initiative. It wasn't just about showcasing portraits anymore, it was about creating a platform where people from all walks of life could share their stories, through art, photography, written word, or even video. It would be a safe space for people to express themselves, free from judgment or societal expectations. We're going to need to scale up quickly, Emily said, leaning forward, her mind racing with possibilities. We'll need partners, local organizations, influencers, maybe even some schools or universities. And we'll need funding, of course. Thomas nodded, looking more energized than ever. I've already started reaching out to some organizations. There's a nonprofit I know that's been focused on youth empowerment, and they're really open to collaborating with artists. I think we could get them on board, especially if we focus on mentorship programs within the workshops. Emily smiled. She knew that building partnerships would be key to making this project sustainable. It wasn't just about the art, it was about creating a ripple effect, where the people involved could inspire others to take the message of inclusivity and self-worth into their own communities. What about the online platform? She asked. How do we make sure it's accessible and doesn't get lost in the noise of social media? That's something I've been thinking about too, Thomas replied. We need a platform that's easy to navigate but also feels personal. Maybe a website or app that allows users to submit their own portraits and stories, share resources for art projects, and have access to community discussions. The platform could have a built-in feature that highlights one story or piece of art every week, kind of like a spotlight, to keep the momentum going. Emily nodded in agreement. I love that idea. If we can keep people engaged, make them feel like they're part of a larger community, it will become something that people really care about. It's not just about creating art, it's about creating a movement, a space for people to feel heard. The conversation shifted to logistics, how to create and maintain the website, potential partnerships with local schools, and the long-term vision for the project. Emily felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in months. This was what she had been working toward. This wasn't just a project, it was the next step in her journey, in changing the way people saw themselves and each other. Later that evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the notes she and Thomas had made, her phone buzzed. It was a message from James. I've been thinking about the project, and I know things are picking up speed. I just wanted to remind you that I'm here for you, no matter what. Don't forget to take care of yourself in all of this. Emily smiled softly. James always knew how to bring her back to center, even when she felt like she was spinning in a million directions. His words were a reminder that, while the world was moving fast, she didn't have to lose herself in it. She typed a quick reply, her heart swelling with gratitude. I'm taking it one step at a time. And thank you. I couldn't do this without you. The following days were filled with more meetings, phone calls, and planning sessions. Emily's calendar was packed, but this time, she approached everything with a clearer mindset. She was balancing the excitement of building something meaningful with the necessity of staying grounded, and it felt like she was finally finding her rhythm. One evening, just after a meeting with a potential sponsor, Emily sat down in her living room, taking a deep breath. She had a few quiet moments before she needed to head to a gallery to discuss an upcoming show. As she stared out the window, her mind drifted to where it all started, the small idea that had sparked the real you, and how far she had come. The road hadn't been easy. There had been moments of self-doubt, times when she questioned whether it was worth pushing so hard. But as she looked at the progress they had made, the faces of the people who had already been touched by the project, Emily knew it had all been worth it. Every late night, every conversation, every setback, it had all been part of the process. She heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her, and before she could turn, James's voice filled the room. How's it going? He asked, his tone light but laced with genuine curiosity. Emily turned around to find him standing in the doorway, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It's going well, she said, her voice filled with conviction. I think we're ready for the next big step. The Real You isn't just going to be a local project anymore. We're going global. James raised an eyebrow, impressed. I knew you could do it. Emily smiled, feeling a warmth settle in her chest. We're doing it together. As they stood there, side by side, Emily couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, she knew they were on the right path. The weeks following their meeting with the foundation were a blur of activity and excitement. The real you had taken on a life of its own, expanding faster than Emily could have predicted. After receiving backing from the foundation, she had begun the process of transitioning from a small, local initiative to something much larger. What started as a project meant to change perceptions in a local gallery had now become a global movement, one that aimed to reshape the way people viewed self-worth, appearance, and identity. Emily, however, wasn't entirely prepared for the whirlwind that came with this kind of expansion. The new partnerships, media attention, and growing team made it all feel like a dream, one that was simultaneously exhilarating and overwhelming. There were days when Emily felt like she was juggling 100 things at once, unsure of which direction to go next. But through it all, she stayed focused on the core of what she wanted to accomplish, creating a world where people were seen for who they truly were, not just for how they looked. One morning, as she sat at her desk reviewing new proposals and emails, Emily received a message that made her pause. It was from Elaine, the manager of the Crystal Palace. Emily had kept in touch with her since their conversation at the gala, but this message felt different. "I'd like to invite you to an event at the Crystal Palace. It's been a few months, and we've been working on some changes here that I'd love to share with you. We'd like to host a dinner in honor of the real you and your incredible work. Let me know if you're interested." At first, Emily was unsure how to respond. The Crystal Palace had been the site of so much pain and frustration for her, a place where she had been dismissed simply for the way she looked. But something about Elaine's message felt sincere. The restaurant had reached out to her before to apologize, but this felt like a real invitation, one that came with an opportunity for something positive to come from it. After discussing it with James, Emily decided to attend. She was no longer angry about the events that had unfolded at the restaurant. She had learned that change didn't come easily, and sometimes, it took the willingness to forgive and move forward in order to create that change. Plus, the idea of having the real you recognized in such a prominent venue was hard to ignore. It was a step forward for the project, and perhaps even for the Crystal Palace itself. The night of the dinner arrived, and Emily stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple dress she had chosen for the occasion. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. This night wasn't about appearances, it was about the progress she had made, the work she had done, and the people whose lives had been touched by her project. James stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You've already done so much, Emily," he said softly. "You've changed so many lives. Just remember tonight is about celebrating that." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know. I'm just nervous, I guess. It's hard not to feel a little apprehensive." James smiled, squeezing her shoulder. "You're going to be great. You've already proven that you don't need anyone's approval to do incredible things. But tonight, you get to show them who you really are." They arrived at the Crystal Palace together, and Emily couldn't help but notice the contrast between how she felt walking through those doors now and how she had felt that first night. Back then, she had been humiliated, made to feel like she didn't belong. But tonight, as she entered with James by her side, she felt a sense of empowerment. No longer was she the woman who had been judged for the way she looked. She was the woman who had built a movement, one that was slowly but surely shifting the narrative. As they entered the restaurant, Elaine greeted them warmly. "Emily, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, her smile genuine. "I've been looking forward to this evening. We've made some changes here, and we wanted to show our appreciation for the work you've done." Emily smiled back, feeling a sense of relief. The tension she had initially felt when receiving the invitation seemed to dissipate in that moment. Elaine had spoken about the changes the restaurant had been working on, but seeing it firsthand, seeing how genuine her desire for transformation was, felt like a step in the right direction. "We're all here to learn and grow," Elaine continued, as they were led to their table. "And the real you has given us a new perspective. We've realized that we need to move beyond appearances and embrace what really matters, what people bring to the table, not just in terms of status, but in terms of character. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of her work and the steps they were taking to change the narrative. It wasn't about one night or one conversation, it was about the long-term impact. They were starting to break down barriers, not just in the world of art and social justice, but in places where exclusivity had once been the norm. As the dinner progressed, Emily found herself surrounded by people who had been impacted by her work, as well as by new faces, people who were interested in hearing more about the real you and how they could contribute. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one where more and more people were becoming aware of the value of inclusivity, of breaking down the superficial standards that had long defined so much of society. As the evening continued, Emily found herself deeply immersed in conversations that were both inspiring and challenging. She had expected the dinner to be a formal affair, but the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. There was a sense of genuine curiosity in the air, as if people were finally beginning to understand the true message behind the Real You project. They asked thoughtful questions, shared their own experiences, and expressed a genuine desire to make changes in their communities. Elaine moved between the tables, making sure everyone was comfortable and engaging with guests, but Emily couldn't help but notice how different the restaurant felt. The air was lighter, less stuffy, and more inclusive. The staff, who had once looked at her with judgment in their eyes, now smiled warmly, engaging with the guests in ways that felt authentic rather than forced. At one point, Emily was approached by a man who introduced himself as a local philanthropist. He was intrigued by her project and wanted to learn more. His interest was genuine, and after a few minutes of conversation, he made an unexpected offer. "I have a foundation myself," he said, focused on supporting young artists from underprivileged backgrounds. "What you're doing with the Real You aligns with our mission, and I'd love to explore ways we can collaborate. Maybe funding or even some joint exhibitions down the road?" Emily was stunned. This was the kind of connection she had dreamed of but hadn't expected to find so soon. "That sounds incredible," she said, her heart racing. "I would love to explore that further. Let's definitely keep in touch." As they exchanged contact information, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope. This wasn't just about changing a few minds at the Crystal Palace, it was about creating a ripple effect, reaching people who shared her vision and wanted to help it grow. After the meal, as Emily and James prepared to leave, Elaine caught up with them. She looked both relieved and hopeful. "I'm glad you came tonight, Emily. I think this is just the beginning for us. We've made some important changes here, and I truly hope we can continue to support your work." Emily smiled, feeling the weight of the evening's significance. "Thank you for inviting me," she said. "It means a lot to see the restaurant taking steps in the right direction. And I believe we can do even more together." As they left the restaurant, stepping into the cool night air, Emily felt a sense of pride. Not only had the night been a success for the Real You, but it had also represented a moment of true change. The Crystal Palace, a place that had once dismissed her, had now invited her in, recognized the value of her work, and began to acknowledge the need for inclusivity and openness. "This is exactly what I've been hoping for," James said, his voice filled with admiration. "The conversation is shifting, Emily. You're making it happen." She looked up at him, her heart full. "We're making it happen," she corrected softly. "This is just the start. There's still so much to do." James smiled, his eyes filled with pride and love. "I know. And I'm with you every step of the way." As they walked together down the city streets, the weight of the evening settled in. The path forward was clearer now. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But Emily was no longer afraid. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she was not alone in this journey. The next morning, Emily woke up early, her mind buzzing with new ideas for expanding the Real You. She had always known that it would take time, but now, with the support of so many people, some new, some old, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a project anymore, it was a movement, one that was changing lives and shifting perspectives. She spent the morning drafting plans for the next exhibition, one that would be even bigger and more inclusive. She could feel the energy around her growing, the excitement building with every conversation, every partnership. As she sat at her desk, going over her notes, a thought crossed her mind: this is just the beginning. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't overwhelmed. She was ready. Ready to take the next step, ready to face the challenges, and ready to create the world she had always envisioned. The day Emily received the call confirming their partnership with the nonprofit foundation was the day she realized just how far the real you had come. Her heart raced as the words sank in. This was happening. The project that had started as a personal mission to showcase the beauty and complexity of real human stories had blossomed into something much larger, a movement that was beginning to take on a life of its own. She sat down in her studio, a wave of emotion washing over her. She had worked tirelessly to bring this project to life, often doubting whether the world would truly embrace it. There had been countless sleepless nights, moments when she wondered if the vision she had was too ambitious, too far-fetched. But now, as the nonprofit came on board, Emily felt a sense of validation. It wasn't just the art that was impactful, it was the conversations it sparked, the awareness it raised, and the space it created for people to see and hear each other, without judgment. The nonprofit had been following the real you for months, and after attending one of her exhibitions, they had reached out with an offer to collaborate. The partnership would bring her project to a wider audience, especially to underserved communities where the stories of those most marginalized were rarely told. This was everything Emily had hoped for. However, with this new partnership came an increased responsibility. The scale of the project was growing, and as much as she wanted to expand, she knew she had to stay grounded in what had made the real you so impactful in the first place. She couldn't lose sight of the people who had inspired her, those who had shared their truths with her through art and stories. She knew that as the movement grew, it was crucial to maintain the authenticity that had made it meaningful to begin with. Emily had always been someone who believed in the power of individual voices, but now, with the support of a larger network, she was realizing that the collective strength of many voices could be even more powerful. She was more determined than ever to amplify those voices, voices that had long been silenced, ignored, or dismissed by mainstream society. As she made plans for the next big exhibition, Emily reflected on the journey she had taken so far. She had come a long way from the day she had been turned away at the Crystal Palace. The pain of that moment had motivated her, driven her to create something that would force people to see others for who they truly were. And now, here she was, on the brink of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The evening before the exhibition was set to launch, Emily sat in her living room, going over the final details with James. They had spent months planning this event, organizing everything from the artists to the venue, and now it was time for it all to come together. The gallery space was packed, the portraits beautifully displayed, and the stories of those who had contributed were ready to be shared with the world. James, sensing her anxiety, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've already done so much, Emily. This is your time to shine. The work you've put into this has already made an impact. Tomorrow is just the next chapter." She smiled, appreciating his unwavering support. "I just hope people understand the heart of it, James. It's more than just art. It's about giving people a chance to be seen, to have their stories told." "You've already done that," James said softly. "And now, the world gets to see it too." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. Tomorrow, the exhibition would open to the public, and this time, it wouldn't just be a local event, it would be the beginning of something much bigger, reaching people across the world who were ready for change. As she stood up, preparing to go over her notes one last time, she felt a sense of gratitude for everything that had brought her to this point. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but it had also been incredibly rewarding. She had learned so much, not just about art, but about herself, about people, and about what it meant to make a real difference. The night before the exhibition, Emily lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the next day. Despite the exhaustion from the weeks of planning, her heart was still full of nervous energy. This was a huge step forward for the real you, but she also knew it would be a pivotal moment. The world was about to see the faces and stories that had been hidden for far too long. She couldn't help but wonder, would it have the impact she hoped for? Would people truly understand the depth of the message? James was already asleep beside her, but Emily found herself restless. She didn't want to wake him, so instead, she quietly got up and walked to her studio, hoping the familiar space would give her some peace. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the walls covered with portraits from past exhibitions, each face telling a story of struggle, resilience, and strength. They weren't just faces, they were voices. And now, their voices were about to be heard on a larger scale. As she sat at her desk, Emily picked up one of the portraits. It was of a young woman named Sarah, who had shared her story of growing up in a community where women were often silenced. Her portrait showed a woman strong yet vulnerable, her eyes filled with the quiet defiance of someone who refused to be invisible. Emily remembered the first time Sarah had told her story. She had been hesitant, unsure if anyone would listen, but through the real you, Sarah had found a way to speak her truth, to be seen. Emily smiled softly as she traced the lines of the portrait. This project wasn't just about her or the art, it was about giving people like Sarah a chance to redefine their narrative. With a deep breath, Emily made a decision. The exhibition had grown far beyond what she had envisioned, and the pressure of its success weighed heavily on her. But tonight, she would remind herself of the reason she started it all. Tomorrow, when the world would see what they had created, it wasn't just about the art. It was about the stories, the voices of people who deserved to be seen and heard. She took out her phone and typed a quick message to James, "Thank you for believing in me. For everything. Tomorrow is a big day, but we're ready." James replied almost immediately, "I believe in you, Emily. And I believe in the difference you're making. You've already changed so many lives." His words were comforting, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this journey. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the lives that had been touched, the stories that had been shared, and the hope that more people would begin to see the value in every individual, no matter their background or appearance. The next day, the gallery was alive with energy. The space, which had once been a cold, sterile environment, was now warm and inviting, filled with color, emotion, and the quiet hum of conversations. Guests milled about, admiring the portraits and listening to the stories behind them. Emily stood at the center, her heart swelling with pride as people paused to take in each piece of art and the person it represented. James stood by her side, offering encouragement and support as always. He knew how important this moment was to her, how much work it had taken to get here. They both knew that this exhibition wasn't just a milestone, it was a turning point. It was proof that art could be a catalyst for change, that stories could transcend walls and reach people in ways words alone could not. As the evening went on, Emily found herself in conversation after conversation with people who were deeply moved by the exhibition. Some were inspired to get involved in their own communities, others wanted to help fund the project's future growth. Emily had hoped for this kind of engagement, but seeing it unfold in front of her was nothing short of magical. Around midnight, as the last guests filtered out, Emily and James stood in the quiet of the empty gallery. The soft hum of the lights above was the only sound. "You did it," James said, his voice full of admiration. "The real you is going to change the world." Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had started this project to make a difference, to challenge the way people viewed each other, and to create a space where everyone could feel seen. And tonight, she had seen that happen. But she also knew this was just one step of many. She turned to James, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've made a start, but there's so much more to do. This isn't just the beginning of the real you, this is the beginning of something even bigger." James nodded, his expression full of understanding. "And I'll be here with you, every step of the way." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the evening's success settling in. The path ahead was clear, more exhibitions, more stories, more lives to touch. But Emily knew now that she wasn't just fighting for change. She was helping others to realize their own power, to show the world that everyone deserved to be seen. The weeks following the exhibition were a whirlwind for Emily. With the success of the Real You moving beyond her wildest expectations, the world seemed to be taking notice. Invitations poured in from different cities, asking her to share her story, to showcase the portraits, and to spread the message of inclusivity. It was thrilling, but also overwhelming. The demand for her time and energy had doubled, and Emily found herself juggling more meetings, events, and phone calls than she had ever imagined. While she appreciated the attention and support, she couldn't help but feel a sense of distance growing between herself and the original intention behind the project. The Real You had always been about empowering people to share their stories, to show who they truly were, free from judgment. But now, it seemed that the art itself was being overshadowed by the success of the movement, and Emily was starting to lose sight of the heart of it all. One evening, as she sat at her desk, reviewing another proposal for a new collaboration, she felt the weight of the work pressing down on her. The room was quiet, save for the soft clicking of her keyboard. Her eyes flicked to the portraits on the wall, the faces of people whose lives had been changed by this project, whose stories had been given a platform. For a moment, Emily simply stared at the images, a sense of gratitude washing over her. These were the people who mattered most. But then, the doubt crept in. Is this what I wanted? She asked herself. Has the project become something it wasn't meant to be? The phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a text from James. How are you holding up, love? I know this week has been insane. She paused before typing her response. The truth was, she wasn't sure how she was holding up. She had never felt more conflicted about what she was doing. Her heart was still in the project, but she felt the pull of something deeper, something more personal. I'm okay. Just feeling a little overwhelmed. There's so much going on, and I don't want to lose track of why we started all of this. James's reply came quickly. I understand. Let's take a break this weekend, just the two of us. A day away from everything, okay? You deserve it. Emily smiled at the message. As much as she knew she needed to focus on the project, she also realized that she had neglected the time and space she needed to recharge. It wasn't just about the movement or the exhibitions. It was about finding balance, something she had struggled with since the Real You had started to grow. The weekend came, and Emily followed James's suggestion. They spent the day at a quiet cabin by the lake, far away from the demands of the city and the constant stream of emails and calls. It was a peaceful day, filled with long walks, laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt her shoulders relax, her mind slow down, and her spirit find a bit of calm. As the day wound down and they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James turned to her. I know this project means everything to you, Emily. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You've built something incredible, but you can't pour from an empty cup. His words were exactly what she needed to hear. Emily had known it in her heart all along, but hearing it from James, someone who had supported her unconditionally, made it feel more real. She had always thought that in order to make a difference, she needed to give everything she had. But now, she was beginning to understand that in order to truly make a difference, she had to also give to herself. The following week, Emily returned to the city with a renewed sense of clarity. The break had been exactly what she needed. She felt stronger, more centered, and ready to refocus on her mission without losing sight of herself in the process. It was time to strike a better balance between the external demands of the Real You and her internal need for rest and reflection. Back at her studio, she began to sort through the emails and requests that had piled up during her time away. As she sifted through them, she found herself pausing at one particular invitation. It was from an international organization, a well-known group dedicated to global education and equality. They wanted to collaborate on a large-scale initiative, incorporating the Real You into their next global campaign. It was an exciting opportunity, one that could amplify the movement even more. But as Emily read through the details, she felt a knot form in her stomach. This was exactly the kind of success she had dreamed of when she first started, but now, it didn't feel quite as simple as it once had. It was tempting. The visibility, the funding, the connections, it could catapult the project to new heights. But it also meant more pressure, more responsibility, and more time away from the very people the project was meant to serve. She sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. She had always believed that art could change the world, but she was now wondering if the world might be changing her project in ways she hadn't anticipated. James came in a little while later, finding her deep in thought. He could tell by the way she was holding the letter that she was wrestling with something important. "What's on your mind?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Emily handed him the letter, her fingers still holding onto it like it might slip away if she wasn't careful. "This," she said quietly. "This could take the real you to places I've only dreamed of. But I'm scared it'll lose its heart along the way." James read through the invitation, nodding thoughtfully. "I get why you're torn. This is big. But maybe it's not about saying yes or no right now. Maybe it's about figuring out what you want this project to be in the long run, and whether this partnership aligns with that vision." She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I've always said I want the real you to be inclusive, to empower people to share their stories. But I don't want it to become just another trendy project. I want to keep it real, rooted in the people who've inspired me, who've trusted me with their truths." James placed his hand over hers, offering the support she had grown accustomed to. "You've built something from the ground up, Emily. You have the power to shape it however you want. If this collaboration doesn't align with your values, then it's okay to walk away." Emily stared at the letter, her heart a little lighter now that she had spoken her thoughts out loud. "It's not that I don't want to help, or that I don't want to grow the real you. It's just that the more it grows, the harder it is to maintain that intimacy, the thing that made it special in the first place." James smiled at her, his eyes full of understanding. "That's the tricky part, isn't it? Growth is inevitable, but it doesn't mean you have to lose sight of what makes it yours." Emily took a deep breath and looked around her studio. The walls were adorned with faces, every one of them unique, every one of them a story that needed to be told. This, she realized, was what mattered most. The people, the stories, the authenticity. If she stayed true to that, then everything else would fall into place. "I'm going to reply to them," Emily said, determination in her voice. "But not in the way they expect. The real you isn't just a project, it's a movement. And it needs to stay grounded in the community it was built on." James leaned in and kissed her forehead. "I think that's the best decision." That evening, Emily crafted her reply. She thanked the organization for their interest and their vision, but politely declined the collaboration. Instead, she outlined a new proposal, one that invited them to come alongside the real you, not as a way to turn it into something it wasn't, but as partners who could help elevate and amplify the voices of those already involved. She asked them to join the conversation, not to dictate it. As she hit send, Emily felt a sense of calm settle over her. It wasn't just about turning down a big opportunity, it was about reaffirming what she had always believed. That the real you wasn't about the flashy lights or the fame or the accolades. It was about giving people the opportunity to be seen for who they really were, in all their complexity and vulnerability. And in that moment, Emily knew she had made the right decision. The movement would grow, yes, but it would do so on her terms, with integrity and authenticity at its core. She could still be a part of something bigger, but it wouldn't come at the cost of losing what had made it so special in the first place. The morning of the grand exhibition arrived, and Emily could hardly contain her excitement. This event was different from the others. It was the culmination of everything she had worked toward, the expansion of the real you into a global movement, the partnerships she had forged, and the countless stories she had helped share. The gallery space was buzzing with energy, with artists, journalists, and supporters gathering to witness the next chapter of the project. As Emily stepped into the gallery, she was met with the familiar warmth of the space, but this time it felt more alive. The walls were adorned with a new collection of portraits, some from the first exhibition, others from new communities that had come forward to be a part of the initiative. Every photograph, every brushstroke on canvas, represented a life, a story, and a voice that had once been overlooked. But now, they were all visible, front and center for the world to see. James was by her side as always, his presence grounding her in the midst of the whirlwind. They walked together, greeting guests and supporters, but Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was no longer just about her, it was about the community she had built, about the people whose stories had inspired her to keep going. The thought of it made her heart swell with pride, and she couldn't stop smiling. "This is it," she said to James, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and excitement. "We've come so far." He smiled, his arm around her waist. "You've come so far, Emily. You've turned a dream into something real, something that's impacting lives." The first guests began to arrive, and Emily was pulled into conversation after conversation. She spoke to people who had been moved by the portraits, people who wanted to get involved, people who had learned about the project from a distance and wanted to support it. It felt like the movement was truly taking on a life of its own, and she was humbled by the outpouring of support. But as the evening wore on, Emily found herself in the quietest corner of the gallery, her gaze drifting to the wall in front of her. There, illuminated by soft lighting, was the portrait of a woman named Anna. Anna's story had been one of the most challenging for Emily to hear, a young mother who had escaped an abusive relationship, fighting for a better life for her children. Her portrait wasn't just a face, it was a testament to strength, survival, and the ability to rebuild. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat as she thought about the journey Anna had been through, the courage it had taken to share her story. It was then that she realized something: this project, this movement, had not just been about art. It had been about people, real people with real stories. It had been about giving them the opportunity to redefine their narrative, to show the world that they were not invisible. The walls of this gallery were filled with stories of resilience, love, pain, and hope. And as Emily stood there, surrounded by the fruits of her labor, she felt a profound sense of peace. But it wasn't over yet. As the night continued, Emily began to think about the future of the real you. She had already seen the power of storytelling, of what could happen when people were given a chance to speak their truth. The next steps were clear: the platform needed to expand, and more communities needed to be reached. There was so much more to do, but for now, she allowed herself to revel in the moment, to appreciate how far the project had come. As the evening drew on, the gallery became more crowded, the hum of conversation growing louder. Emily moved through the room, greeting people, listening to their feedback, and soaking in the joy that radiated from the guests. This event was more than just a celebration of art, it was a moment of validation for the years of hard work, the sleepless nights, and the deep-rooted belief in what the real you could achieve. Soon, Emily found herself standing near the back of the gallery, watching as people admired Anna's portrait. It was one of the most powerful images in the exhibition, and its impact was evident in the way people paused in front of it, taking a moment to truly look. The conversation around her shifted, and she overheard a group of guests discussing the stories behind the portraits, the transformative nature of each piece. The words change and empowerment floated around the room like a promise, an echo of the very essence of her project. As Emily stood there, she realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, when the project was no longer just her vision but a collective movement, one that had touched the hearts of so many. It wasn't just about making people feel seen. It was about making them feel valued, important, and worthy of being heard. For every person who had walked through the gallery that evening, the real you had offered a chance to reflect, to understand, and to grow. "Emily, I think you've just changed the entire game," a voice said from behind her, breaking her from her thoughts. She turned to find Elaine standing there, a warm smile on her face. "This exhibition, it's incredible. It's not just a collection of art. It's a statement." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Elaine. That means a lot." Elaine's eyes sparkled with something more than appreciation, there was admiration in them, too. You've created something that's not only beautiful but necessary. You've given a platform to people who've been silenced for too long. And now, the world is starting to listen. For a moment, Emily couldn't find the words to respond. She had come so far from the woman who had been turned away at the Crystal Palace, the one who had felt invisible, dismissed, and overlooked. And now, here she was, standing in the very place that had once symbolized rejection, hearing words of encouragement and recognition for the very thing that had been born out of that experience. It was more than she had ever dreamed. As the night continued, Emily found herself pulled into more conversations, each one reinforcing the impact her project was having. From community leaders to local artists, everyone seemed eager to contribute to the next phase of the real you. It was clear that the project had transcended its original boundaries and had become something larger than anyone had anticipated. Later, as the gallery started to empty, Emily and James found a quiet spot in the corner of the room. The evening had been a success, but she could sense the exhaustion settling in. They sat together for a moment, the weight of the night's events hanging in the air. "You've done it, Emily," James said softly, his eyes filled with pride. "This is what you've worked for." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the tension of the past few months begin to ease. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. James kissed the top of her head gently. "And you never have to. We're in this together." As the last guests left, and the gallery lights dimmed, Emily took one final look at the portraits that filled the space. There were still many more stories to be told, more voices to be heard, and more lives to be impacted. But for now, she allowed herself to enjoy the fruits of her labor, knowing that this night had been a pivotal moment in the journey of the real you. It wasn't just about art or exhibitions. It was about shifting perceptions, breaking down barriers, and giving people the dignity they deserved. And as Emily looked around the quiet gallery, she knew that this was just the beginning of something even bigger. The world was ready to hear the voices of those who had long been silenced, and the real you would be there to amplify them every step of the way.